Good evening and welcome. Thank you all for coming. Just before we start, I think I want to mention or put in a quick plug for this lecture on Monday by the Swiss architect Peter Merkley. He hasn't really been to the GSD, as far as I can remember, ever before. And he will be here on Monday, and it would be great if you could join us. And on Tuesday, we finally have the opening of the Center for Green Buildings and Cities, which will also host a public symposium here in Piper at 4 p.m. Related to some of the kind of work of the center, but also working on issues related to typology, design, and sort of technologies that relate to the House Zero project. Tonight, after the presentation, or brief presentation by Reinier de Graaf, we've invited, and I'm really happy that Professors Diane Davis and Alex Krieger will be joining Reinier for a discussion. The intention is to have the presentation be shorter than the normal lecture length so that we can actually have more time for discussion. Reinier is currently teaching an option studio with a similar title, or the same title to the talk tonight, which is Phantom Urbanism. And the studio, they've just returned from, I think, what seems like a fantastic trip to Angola, and I suspect we'll hear more about that. You probably all know that Reinier is one of the main partners at the Office for Metropolitan Architecture, OMA, is based in Rotterdam, and I think, for the longest time, probably he's been the most important member of the office focusing on the urban design or the architecture of the large-scale component of the office. Apart from, some of the work that Rem has been doing, he really has been taking on that relationship, that work. And I was lucky enough to be able to spend a fair bit of time with Reinier when there was a project called Skolkovo that Reinier and OMA were working on, and I had some role there. And of course, Laura Bird, who's here visiting and will be part of the reviews tomorrow, was also at that time involved. So it's really a great kind of little reunion of the Skolkovo team. Since that time, what is interesting is to see how Reinier has really gone more and more towards the design of large-scale buildings, and buildings that are really essentially kind of, significant major urban buildings. He's completed a few of those. The Timmerhuis, which is a mixed-use project in Rotterdam, the headquarters for G-Star Row, and this amazing project, the Rotterdam, which I got to see in their office while he was in Angola when I was there, which is really pretty amazing. Recently, Reinier has published this very exciting, very interesting book called Four Walls and a Roof, which is published by Harvard University Press. It's subtitled The Complex Nature of a Simple Profession, and in it there are really an amazing number of very beautiful, exciting, interesting themes and topics, and hopefully Reinier will be able to tell us a little bit about the book, but also more about phantom urbanism. Please join me in welcoming Reinier de Graaf.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. Thanks, Moisen, for the kind introduction. I have no idea what the normal length of a lecture is. I generally don't make it beyond 40 minutes, and I don't think I will do that today. I think when we first discussed the sort of notion of a talk here, it was meant to be about the book, and in part it is about the book, but the studio that's currently underway is developing very well, and in many ways already considerably more interesting than the book. So I, cannot resist the temptation of giving a little bit of a trailer of the studio too. Anyway, a little bit about the book. The book, if I were to summarize it very, very briefly, is a 500-page attempt to hammer away at what I see as the misplaced confidence of the architecture profession. It has 44 essays divided over 7 parts, each of which, in a way, debunks a myth that I think is looming over the architecture profession. There's a myth of authority, the myth of individual inspiration, the myth of good causes, the myth of professionalism, the myth of independence, mastery over the large scale, and finally, progress. These are, of course, in themselves all very admirable and laudable properties, but it is very, very clear that a slight change of context and a slight difference actually turns these 7 virtues potentially into 7 cardinal sins. I think that in the context, in the transition of the 20th to the 21st century, certain profound changes have happened to the context within which architecture is produced that in a way make it impossible to simply uncritically continue that ethos, and I will try to explain. Essentially, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the 20th century ended. The 20th century ended early and the 21st century begun. This is an argument very eloquently made by Francis Fukuyama, first in an essay after the fall of the wall, which he later expanded into a book, omitting the question mark behind end of history, where actually he argues that with the fall of the wall and with the collapse of the Soviet Union, a world that used to be a world of competing ideologies, a Western bloc, a communist bloc, and a non-aligned bloc, would pretty soon become a homogeneous world which would collectively embrace Western liberal democracy as the sole and only form of human government. So this was in the 90s, and interestingly, that was also the moment that our office expanded very, very strongly. And I think many firms like us, in a way, the wave of optimism that followed the fall of the Berlin Wall led to the belief of the fact that you could work anywhere, encounter relatively similar conditions. Encounter relatively similar conditions to wherever you worked, and at that moment I think we went from 30 to 300 people. Of course, when you work in the whole world ends up working at you. So we have a very interesting office, 350 people, just under 50 nationalities. It's very interesting that in the Netherlands the Dutch are a minority, which is very good. In the New York office, the Americans, or at least New Yorkers, are a minority, which is even better. In Hong Kong, the Chinese are a minority, believe it or not. And in Dubai, of course, everybody is a minority. And I'm not saying that to do some sort of united colors of architecture, but I think that the ecology of minorities is a very interesting factor and maybe the secret of our office, that when there is only minorities, creation becomes a matter of a permanent cultural clash in which there are very few a prioris, in which there isn't any given truth, like we do things this way and you have to integrate. There is just arguments, there is just doubts, there is just a fairly openly professing of not knowing. This is a typical scene in the office. I believe this is ages ago, when essentially I think our New York partner was an intern. The man you see here is the founder of our office. It's a sort of collectively professed doubt in which the founder of the office seems overcome by the most extreme doubt. And anyway, and that doubt creates a lot of versions, creates a lot of rejected versions, creates a lot of trial and error, and occasionally it creates a result, and sometimes a very big result. This is CCTV. completed in 2008 for the Chinese Olympics, came into the office in 2002. And this is, I think, indicative of the world the way it was then. We had the choice to participate in the reconstruction of the World Trade Center or take part in the competition for the Chinese television's headquarters. And that was an almost neutral decision at the time. That was a decision, it's essentially a business decision. We knew CCTV would get built because of the Olympics, and we suspected the World Trade Center would become a very long American talk show. So essentially we chose for CCTV, but purely on the basis of pragmatic arguments. And that is interesting if you think about that now, because it's over 25 years ago that the Berlin Wall fell and the world supposedly opened up. But meanwhile, other walls are being contemplated. And essentially everywhere, between political blocs, between religions, between continents, etc., with a very predictable result in many ways. This is the total number. This is essentially our project list. This is everything that happens. What is crossed out is everything that doesn't happen. And curiously, probably the projects that get started and never get finished are more telling about the state of the world at present than the projects that do get finished. And I want to talk a little bit about a number of efforts that never got finished. This is another very interesting aspect is the following of these walls appearing. This is what Fukuyama predicted. And on the whole, a Western liberal democratic world. I think crudely, the world today looks something like this, if you have to rate it according to democracy. The blue is democracy, the red is dictatorship. There you don't have elections, and the yellow is a category which is sort of democratic, but not really. You have elections, but you know beforehand who's going to win, and if that doesn't happen, then certain things are done to ensure that he will win, etc., etc., etc. But it's an increasingly successful category, a category in which a lot of urbanism at the moment takes place. It's a category that presents a very interesting veil to dictatorial regimes to become democratic, but not really. But it also presents a very tempting alternative to countries that were democratic at one point to slide back into authoritarian rule. So my prediction is that the amount of yellow in this map will grow over time. This is a project in a very straightforward situation. Here you don't have elections. The glorious Republic of Kazakhstan, a former Soviet republic with clearly the ails of Sovietism, but also to some extent the good things of Sovietism, a very interesting and ambitious public housing program. But after the discovery of oil in Kazakhstan, Kazakhstan joined the ranks of the world. Joining the ranks of the world looks like this. It's a nightclub in Almaty, which is very appropriately called Petroleum. That leads also to particular views on architecture for some reason. Money based on oil well leads to a kind of eruption of postmodernism and Liebeskind for some inexplicable reason. But it's not just here. We're finding this to be somewhat of a pattern. But maybe we can discuss. Anyway, we wouldn't be if we didn't propose a project based on former constructivist diagrams, assuming there would be an appetite for that. So this was a science campus close to the mountains, close to the Chinese border, for which a contractor had been lined up, the contractor that had built the palace of the president, a former Kosovar who turned out was wanted by the Yugoslavia tribunal for smuggling arm. That was the way he had made his fortune and what led him to a second life in Kazakhstan as a contractor. That ultimately didn't materialize. We got another chance in the form of a science city in Russia itself, which had a more solid and firm history of science cities. It's the plan for Skolkovo. This is one that looked like it was on the cards to be won and built for a very long time. We presented it to the then Russian president, Medvedev, who, as we all know, is no longer the president. So to some extent, that didn't happen either. That's a very interesting thing, going back to Fukuyama's argument, is the argument that is presented is ultimately an economic argument. Democracy is made dependent on economic success. The message, in short, is if you become democratic, you become prosperous, you become wealthy. It's your quickest ticket to wealth. But meanwhile, if we look at the global economy and the way it's developing, an interesting thing is emerging. These are the sovereign wealth funds of various nations, and if you make an addition, to some extent you see that apparently non-democracies have the largest capital at their disposal to participate in the global market. You see this everywhere with Emirates Airlines and all kinds of things, where they simply have a head start because the state participates in economic entrepreneurship. So this was Dubai in 1990, Sheikh Zayed Road, the main road. This is a public housing program on the side. This is that same road 25 years later. This is that same public housing project here, but clearly an eruption of a city in a very, very short time, where nothing in this picture is kind of older than 15 years. The city, in a way, celebrates a perpetual tomorrow on real estate fairs, on big sales events of ever more extreme and extravagant towers. In a way, the future of the city of tomorrow is the decorum for the life in the city of today. And interestingly, also its aerial map that you see on Google Earth, which is constantly presented in the city as the Dubai of today, is actually the Dubai of tomorrow. So if you look at this isn't there, or at least it was there, but I think it's meanwhile underwater. This was planned, but it isn't there. This isn't there, and that isn't there, which means that about 50% of what is presented in this photograph as reality in all the promotion of the city actually doesn't exist yet, and never, and perhaps never will. The city is like a collection of individual theme parks, which happily, in a way, compete with each other for attention to attract populations. It's a city with about 85% expats. It's a city with a very small indigenous population, and here the function of urbanism is in a way not to house people that are there, but is to attract people in order to come. So there's a very interesting reversal in this kind of urbanism, where it kind of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. With a lot of these massive planning operations, you ask the people in charge, who is this for? Then the answer is invariably, they will come. And they will come as long as they can buy a part. But they don't come, they buy real estate. And they will continue to buy real estate when they can sell that real estate a few years later for more money than they bought it. But it's a very different role. If you think of urbanism in the 50s and the 60s, which in a way addressed the housing shortage, addressed a demographic need, this is simply of urbanism as a form of wishful thinking. When you see this, endless billboards along the road with developments announced, you think you are looking at a landscape of free enterprise. That isn't true. This is all the property developers responsible for this stuff. If you look at their annual accounts, they invariably belong to 3 holdings, which invariably are majority owned by the royal family. So what you have here is a landscape of free enterprise urbanism, which is actually a disguised monopoly, a very interesting contradiction. Owns it. The administrative structure of the city looks suspiciously like the administrative structure of any city, of Amsterdam or London. But it's the population, the populating of this diagram that is the interesting thing. This is the public sector. This is the private sector. And it is not because of local dress that people look the same. It's simply because they are the same people. Where in any Western democracy, taking up public office means you have to relinquish your business interests. Here, business interests are a prerequisite to take up public office in the first place. To the point that you don't know whether you are looking at a city, at a state, or simply a large corporation that happily competes with other corporations when it needs to. This is the largest property developers of Dubai, and this is where they work. They meanwhile straddle a territory which runs from Algeria all the way to the Philippines and Indonesia. I mean, it's a model. Their rapid urbanism is actually being exported all across the world, operating along very similar lines. Something and exported as a kind of form of knowledge. Something which we've seen before in Singapore, which essentially exports the notion of the place as a form of expertise to build stuff in China, here. And this is a strange thing I found on one of the real estate markets in Dubai. The very confident, extremely confident predicament. One day all cities will be built like this. And it's a curious quote because, I mean, it almost echoes the confidence that was at one time embedded in the modern movement of architecture. I mean, it's something that Le Corbusier could have said in French. Manifestos are written in architecture, but if you put these manifestos in a timeline, something very, very strange presents itself. Almost at the time that Fukuyama wrote his book, When the World Would Be One, No More Need for Ideologies, that is also curiously the time that actually the production of meaningful manifestos stopped in architecture. That is at the same time, around about, let's say, 1990, that is at the same time that large parts of the world went through the most aggressive urbanization in history. So largely in a theoretical vacuum of the profession, which leads to a very strange situation. If this is the city of the future in 1925, the Plan Voisin by Le Corbusier, disparaged, dismissed, over, it is still somehow that model that seems to be the only model available and the prevailing model according to which essentially these waves of urbanization. There's a button called danger on this thing, which which leads to a rather clumsy anyway, in which these urbanization waves continue to happen. It's very interesting. Urbanization also in Asia has a very curious role. The average city dweller represents 5 times the economic value of a rural dweller. So if an enormous amount of people become urbanites, the country gets 5 times as rich. At least that's the reality on paper. To the point that it leads to almost all propaganda in China being heavily infected with kind of real estate. To the point that you don't know whether the strong increase in capita is the urban population growing or whether there is actually a real economic growth, to the point that cause and effect get confused. I mean, do we urbanize because we get richer, or do we get richer because we urbanize? And the strange confusion emerges, and in the wake of that confusion, an interesting other phenomena emerges. This is the city of Ordos in China. An enormously rapidly constructed city, which is entirely empty, owned completely, but empty. Something similar. Another one, Zhengdong New Era, a completely empty city. Chengdu here, lonely man on a bike looking at a replica of Paris, also sold, but completely empty and uninhabited. Maxi Lake City, an empty lake surrounded by empty buildings. And for a long time, a lot has been written about this stuff. And for a long time we thought it was a very Chinese phenomena, simply a phenomena of the planned economy that could afford to build and wait. Meanwhile, that is no longer the case. This is by now a global phenomena. Our studio has developed a kind of top 100 of ghost cities around the world, and it is really a very, very prolific phenomenon. Particularly after the financial crisis of 2008 and the subsequent recovery, when the house price index went sharply up. Incidentally, also after the manifesto, you get this kind of stuff. This is in Spain. Big, optimistic advertisements of real estate that meanwhile, for a considerable length of time, stands empty. Empty. Another city, Valdeluz in Spain, empty. That's a very, very big quarter. Roads and everything built, only partially built, and whatever is built there stands empty. Empty roads, completely designed, planted, but without buildings, to the point that the name sign is the biggest masterpiece in the city. This is another example in Morocco, completely empty. And not a ghost town that has been abandoned, something that has been built within the last 5 years and never inhabited. The most striking example that can be found online is the city of Quilamba in Angola. Conflicting reports on the internet whether it's empty or whether it's not empty, and so we decided to go and see for ourselves. That city is a consequence of a very confident announcement of Angola's president, then-time President Dos Santos, in 2008, when the price of oil was sky high. The city, a Chinese master plan, and a city where largely oil served as collateral for a credit line to build the city, but being built by Chinese companies. This is a man named Pierre Falcon, a French arms dealer who used to trade arms for oil, and after peace broke out he traded concrete for oil, similar, different product, similar action. Here, somebody was also very enwrapped with the son of François Mitterrand in what is known to be Angola Gate. Anyway, he brokered a deal with the Chinese. Welcome here, the site of the city. Sino-Angolan partnership at work. This is part of a promotion film for the city, with the president's personal involvement, Chinese officials, President Dos Santos. President being personally involved here at a model. City for the young as well as the old. A city without barriers. A city with all modern convenience. What is wrong with this image? Anyway, 2012, 4 years later, the price of oil plummeted. The Angolan middle class, which was expected on the basis of oil, never emerged. This is the price that apartments went for. This is what the 2/3 of Angolans live on, less than $2 a day. A big scandal. Al Jazeera, then the BBC, and then CNN all visited the site and reported on the exported Chinese ghost towns. They unmasked the people in the promotional film as actors and showed empty footage of endless rows of empty buildings. And essentially a city for 500,000 people that stood empty. We decided to go and see for ourselves, as I said. Our studio is called Phantom Urbanism. If that's like written on your forehead, nobody really wants to talk to you. So for the duration of the field trip, we had the Harvard website changed in Rapid Urbanism, and from very strongly critical individuals, we became temporary admirers of the phenomenon, but entirely for fact-finding purposes. So the journey from the airport, this was the first phase you see, Viva Fidel. The typical, in a way, African condition on a long way into the airport, and once you reach the center of Angola, an entirely different city presents itself. Two very contrasting reality. Interestingly, Angola is one of the poorest countries in the world, but on the Mercer list, Luanda is the most expensive city in the world. Very, very curious contrast, but it's a contrast that by and large, in a way, determines the face of the city, the almost schizophrenic face of the city. So we first went into the poor half, and then and then we continued our trip to the supposed ghost town, large ghost town in the middle of Angola. Here we were on the edge, and there we visited, in a way, the headquarters of the group that was structured around the former arms dealer who had a project management firm, consultancy, who had brokered the deal with the Chinese. And we were given kind of a royal welcome. We were met by 3 employees, 2 men from Israel and an Angolan guy which was called Israel. I mean, I struggle to this day what that means. Very, very big meeting with the kind of Angolan Chinese flag on the table, where we could ask anything, where they had, I have to say, very plausible answer. I mean, clearly every painful question had been asked at least one time before we showed up. So it was a big charm offensive. They spent a full day with us. They showed us the city, which meanwhile indeed was inhabited. They also educated us. So this curious detail, when you zoom out, is actually simply there to hold the air conditioner unit, and the real balcony is there and actually quite generous. So that shows the bias, not just of the media, but I guess also of us. Anyway, the visit to the mayor of the city, his assistant, and the group, Israeli. Goodbye, and then we continued our journey to the headquarters of CITIC, which is the Chinese investment trust that is responsible for nearly all of these cities in Angola. A hall with a giant model of the city, also announcing further phases to the city. That was the same model around which essentially the Angolan-Chinese partnership was agreed. I wonder whether who laughs and who doesn't is in a way indicative of the story to some point. Also where essentially the deal was signed with, in the background, the arms trader, the French things, and essentially that model, as I said, announcing further construction activity, a very confident thing. In the middle of it, a new convention center, personally selected by the previous president, a sort of parametric semiology in the context of rather mundane housing. So that's what we saw, and in a way what was supposed to have been an encounter with a failure was actually a rather convincing story, but we had more days. So this is day 2. Another town a little bit further away, the town of Zango, actually another kind of ville radieuse built. These buildings are completely empty. This is the people on $2 a day. They were supposed to have become middle class, live there. This is empty. Shanty towns are appearing at the foot. An empty street, buildings meanwhile disconnected from water and standing there like huge empty carcasses. This is still relatively central. And then there are suburbs to the suburb. This is a location further away. Decent looking stuff. Standing there. But also completely empty, almost like a beautiful De Chirico painting, but built for real. There, and another one further away, an endless city. It's again completely empty. Pristine buildings, very recently finished. Empty interiors. What do I do to make the video run? Ah. The wind and the crickets are anyway, the empty street in the same thing. Further out, an empty street to a kind of suburban development. Luxury housing, another luxury resort by the sea, also completely uninhabited, but this one is sold. Another development, this time not in Africa, but in Lebanon. And I've used this example to, in a way, show that we can think about this stuff as very far away, very far removed from our profession, stuff we wouldn't get our hands in. But this is Herzog and de Meuron, with the building, the terraces in Beirut. It's very interesting. This is 2 buildings of the same size. Both are of white concrete, both have 90-degree corners, both are modern. The emptiness in this building is a trauma. It's a hotel that was fought over room by room, never inhabited, and left like a scar in the city. This building is the same size. It's also empty, but the emptiness is completely not a problem because all the apartments have been sold at record prices in Beirut's meanwhile booming real estate market. And I guess you could say stylistically there is a resonance. Nevertheless, if you see one is a symptom of the 20th and the other one of the modernism of the 21st century, an acute difference presents itself, a difference of a completely different role of modernism in the economic system. That building is celebrated very, very loudly in the real estate press, but at the same time in the daily newspapers of Beirut, the building is vilified and actually named and shamed. And for me, and that is the core of where I wanted to get to, it illustrates the difference between the 2 centuries. The century that started with, in a way, modern architecture as a promise of liberation, only to end up physically triumphant, built everywhere. But this is something taken off a Greek real estate website that shows how many tax breaks you can get when you leave a structure unfinished. And it's almost a live version of the domino house, where the physical triumph somehow equals the ideological bankruptcies. And this is the point, I think, where the virtues become sins, where the house that at one point was meant to be available to all stands empty in a remote suburb and is perhaps reason to write a sequel to the book. Thank you.
Yes. The instructions that we received from our dean was to engage you in a discussion about urban design, at which point you said you don't know anything about it when we talked briefly beforehand, which I'm sure is a very modest and untrue statement. So I would like to ask you, I'd like to ask you a question which you don't need to answer immediately, but think about. What is it's a naive question, but it's in the mind of virtually every urban design student in the building, probably for the past 60 years since the program was invented. What's the difference between architecture and urban design? But don't answer that question, because I just want to say something else about what you just showed, or don't answer it immediately. There are different kinds of emptiness. You talked about some of them. I'd like to ask you about what you think about the emptiness of Detroit or Baltimore. Equally empty, but for an entirely different reason, right? So also becoming a 21st century emptiness. So say something about the emptiness that you discover in Detroit, and what the relationship to either the 20th or the 21st century might be.
Well, I'm not per se interested in the emptiness of Detroit, because it's a little off topic. I mean, there's plenty of examples of ghost towns that were at one point inhabited and thriving, and where people have gone away and now they're empty. The thing that I try to show you, and that's the bizarre things, is that all of these things are new, and they were abandoned before they were even populated, which is a kind of weird form of chronochaos, I guess you could name it. And I would side Detroit in a way, possibly a little bit the same way that I sided the Holiday Inn in Beirut. It's an emptiness which has at least absorbed history, and the other emptiness defies history. And on the difference between architecture and urbanism, I don't know. For me, it is very strange to see how much of these Chinese cities, if you look through the hairs of your eyes, how much they actually look like modern paradigms developed in the early 20th century, which are then constructed, and maybe even constructed with the best intention, while there is a global economic system that simply doesn't endure the same type of utopianism anymore. That still doesn't answer your question. But.
Well, I'll ask it again, but I don't want to get you off the hook too easily about Detroit. Because yes, you might say it's an entirely different phenomenon in one way. In another way, it is actually not a different phenomenon, because both are product of sort of misplaced affluence, in a way, right? The reason for Detroit emptiness has all kinds of sort of social and political implications, but it's also the capacity to start again and to build the new rather than to invest in the existing. And in that way, it's not quite so different. There's this phenomenon which I think is shared across sort of political, cultural context, where we now have the capacity, for whatever reason, to simply start over, as opposed to, I suppose, in the good old days, whenever they were, several centuries ago, one didn't have that capacity. One had to kind of improve what was there.
Yeah, I think starting over is a central element of modernism.
Yeah.
And in that sense, you are right, because, I mean, that's also what they're doing in Angola. I mean, they're starting over in a place where there is nothing, and then they start over, and then there is still nothing. I mean, it's quite interesting that we spoke to a lot of people, and the prime reason for many people not to move is not even the cost of the apartments, but the fact that there is simply nothing there, and that they would then still have to come back to the place where they are currently living to do their job. So all that apartment, the slightly more luxurious apartment, would give them the inconvenience of a lengthy commute. And I think you can only start over if you fully start over. And I think a lot of what you see, and you see this, of course, also in Europe, where we have the phenomena of new towns. But as long as there are old towns to steal the limelight, the prevalence of the old makes the starting over always a half-hearted attempt. And I think, therefore, cities where there is absolutely nothing, so if you don't start over, but you start, then it has a certain amount of chance. But a lot of the other stuff remains stuck in a kind of half-heartedness.
Yeah. And do you want to? I'm going to get back to the difference between architecture and design, and actually refer to a question, something you said towards the end of your book, which I wonder whether you said it ironically or sort of positively. But Diane, right? Yeah.
Well, I'm going to let you get back to that conversation because I'm not sure that I'm the person to be involved in that conversation. But I wanted to make a few comments about the really stimulating presentation. I work on the developing world, so the kind of story you're telling is something that I've seen and experienced. I work mostly on Latin America, not Africa, but the question of the building of these big multi-complexes for houses is all over Latin America as well. So, and many of them are abandoned, but they're partially occupied and partially abandoned, which creates a whole set. This was almost aesthetically acceptable, the fact that you have these open, empty places, but in Latin America and outside of Latin American cities, you have those housing complexes which have drugs and violence and people occupying who don't own those places because they've been abandoned by the speculators that lived in them. But I guess I wanted to just share a couple comments with maybe a question or just more clarification. So I liked very much the kind of situating the phenomena in time, not just architectural time, but of course the kind of political economy of time after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and putting on the table regime type and the kinds of politics that are behind the contracts for architects around the world, whether it's in China or Africa, et cetera. I think that's really important and something that we have to think about and be really critical. Most of the big projects that employ architects are these types of projects that you're mentioning there. So it's something to think about the profession. But I also wanted to underscore the fact that that historical moment, that break of the 90s, is also a moment of economic globalization. So it's not just changing the kind of politics, the democracy, the changing number of countries that go from too democratic and then later to authoritarian. It's also a moment of economic globalization where real estate development and investment in property is the general driving force of the global economy and many nations. And in fact, in that sense, the question about Detroit is super interesting because these are related phenomena. The fact that Detroit is abandoned is because we've moved from an industrial economies to service and real estate economies, even though I agree with you, Reinier, that the consequences of it and what it means in the city are very different, but they're two ends of the same global capitalist system. So I guess the question then becomes, to me, for all of us, is there any role at all for architecture, urban design, or even planning in a problem that really is a manifestation of how money moves around the world and uses space for exchange value, not use value anymore? So those places are not being built from the perspective of what it would be like to live in those places. They're purely speculative projects. So that's the one question. And the second one, just we can maybe talk about also, is I'm super interested in the fact that you guys were in Angola. So the role of the Chinese in Africa is very different. I mean, there's still the larger political economy, but it's more the exporting of the Chinese economy into Africa. So we could ask the question, why do Africans allow Chinese to come in here and build those things? There's probably an exchange of goods. There's probably corruption, but there's also natural resource exchange. There's a large economic transaction of which that's one small part. But it's happening in Latin America, not built by the Chinese, but built by domestic, U.S. mass producers, domestic developers. So we see the same phenomena in two very different political places, which makes me think that it really is about how capital works on a global scale. So to repeat my question, what can we do? What is the role of our professions How much room for maneuver is there if that's really what's driving the building project?
You got the question.
I think clearly if we remain unaware of the role of capital and how capital plays, then there is no role. That's my theory. If we build up an awareness of how things work, there is perhaps hope for some role, but I wouldn't go much further than that. It's very interesting that, you know, what changes in a building when you make it to be used or when you make it to be sold? Does anything change? Because the use is still an alibi for the selling, but it's very interesting that what is the underlying motive becomes the ulterior motive and becomes such a driver that, you know, could the whole phenomena of, and I think that you see that in Dubai, and I think star architecture is a very big part of that, that to some extent the postures of extravagance in which architecture is forced in order to draw the attention to keep creating the sales value is, I think, a product of the economic system. I think postmodernism and everything that has happened since is ultimately owes its existence to an economic explanation and not to a stylistic change within the architectural profession. I think the big change after Fukuyama is not even the political system dictatorship as anything. It's that the fact that the global market opens up and cities are forced to compete. And cities are forced to compete with each other on a scale that they never competed before. Cities are built with the hope to attract the small group of people that cities all over the world compete for. So what applies to architecture, a form of extravagance, applies to cities as well. And that then leads back to the question. I think it's also the moment that any traditional distinction between architecture and urbanism becomes extremely problematic, because they are both parts of the same stick, where before you could see urbanism as the kind of planning around a set of predictable parameters, and you had limited time to answer them, and then architecture as the expression of that. Here they really become part of the same metal, where in a joint pact. I mean, the key word in anything, if you saw that egg project that I showed, there's always one word, and we use a lot of words as architects to explain our word, and the word is wow. And that applies to cities, it applies to architecture as well. And I think in that little word, the triumph of the exchange value over the use value is incredibly manifest. I mean, I thought, stupidly, but I did think it, that little air conditioning railing was a balcony, and that one of the effects of an architecture which was simply built for exchange value was that people didn't know how to make balconies anymore because there were no inhabitants anyway, so why get on a balcony? Something just had to look at as a balcony, which I thought was a super nice story until, of course, you go there and you find out it's an air conditioning holder. But that doesn't take from the fact that things like that, take this one step further, things like that could happen. You know, that at a certain point, ingredients of buildings are made to look a certain way, to suggest a certain thing, and that there's already the knowledge that they may never be used that way anyway. And I think of course, it's a relatively young phenomenon, and I don't think we have actually seen the end of that development.
Thing here, I'm sorry. You said something about the distinction between architecture and urbanism, right? And I'm not going to talk about architecture too much, but I do want to say that I think it's important what your presentation and some of the work that I'm doing on these types of places in Mexico suggests to me that it's very important to distinguish between, it's not just the exchange versus use value, the focus, the unit of analysis that you're building for. So is it the physical building, is it the house, or is it the person? So where do people come into this picture? Because this is, of course, a stereotype of what I'd like to think that what we do in an urban planning program, urban planning and design. But in other words, you're building for human life, right? And sometimes you want to make sure that in the architecture, that sense of the entire array of activities that create the quotidian urban experience, that's what I call urbanism. And I think of that as different than architecture, which isn't to say that architecture doesn't contribute to urbanism. But these are projects where, and it's not even that you can blame the architect. It was probably a machine or some mass-produced model. But there's no thought at all about the urban experience. Even the location of them, as you said, people don't go out there because it has nothing to do with what makes a life meaningful. There's no transport, there's no shops, maybe they have public space, which is this big empty lot in between the towers. But there is really no attempt to think about urbanism as creating the conditions of social interaction and meaning. And I think that's what we would like to be able to do by introducing the kind of discourses of planning, urban design, and architecture together in the same set of, working together to create those spaces. And the models that we're seeing around the world do not have that mindset. They're just about the building and its exchange value.
Yeah, although the one example that we did find to be inhabited, I mean, the one ghost city that wasn't a ghost city, did have shops, it did have public space, it did have interaction, it seemed a relatively happy place, and it was not that dissimilar from the other ones, it was just inhabited. And often that is, I mean, I was born in an area which was also mass-produced, prefabricated, and probably with none of the noble considerations you're listing ever on the mind of the designers. Nevertheless, I remember that as a place with a lot of social interaction and a warm place as well, even though it was an industrially produced thing. So I think that is a very complex thing. I just think it's a matter of timing. It's interesting you say, what makes this happen? Why do the Chinese do that in Angola? Because Angola wants to reconstruct. It wants to get a loan of the IMF or of the World Bank, and they say no, because you are a corrupt country. We won't get our money back. What happens then? Then there's a power in the East who has to do virtually nothing. You know, it just has to wait until all the discarded, rejected countries by the international financial institutions just line up, come to them. They essentially trade oil for concrete. They even avoid a monetary component to it. They completely elude the financial system. They don't play by the rules. And that's also a very different world from the world of Fukuyama. Yes, it's a global economy, but it's with 3 or 4 different sets of rules, and nobody's strong enough to enforce one of these sets as the law for all. So I think what we're very much witnessing is not the end of globalization, but a breakup of globalization in compartments, and the jury is out which will be victorious. Because I mean, also in Angola, you get a lot of people from the West, and they produce big books, brochures. They analyze patterns of slums as interestingly humane things, but they do nothing. Essentially the Chinese built, that stands empty. So it's a very curious mix between, let's say, Western highbrow impotence and Chinese can-do, and either of them seem extraneous to the place. And it is that gap, no, but I'm serious, it's that gap that I find extremely interesting to explore, and that I also don't explicitly have an answer to. I mean, sorry, you want to talk about Detroit again? Or?
I actually think that Detroit is equally fascinating, but I'll move on.
But I don't really want to talk about it, but I appreciate that is all you want to talk about. But
I actually want to get back to the distinctions between architecture and urban design, which is actually an expansion of what Diane started to say. Again, in an earlier conversation, you said something about, okay, so when you go to Angola right now, what does the architect do? The answer is not in an additional building. There's no need for an additional building.
Not in the context of this stuff.
Yes,
no.
yes, that's right. Okay, so here's a distinction for me between architecture and urban design, and why I think that urban design may be less complicit in this phenomenon that you're just describing. Because buildings are not our only technique. If you, as an architect, well, You either build that building, whether it's necessary or not, or I don't know what you do. But the possibility of an urban design discipline, and obviously to the extent that there is a corollary planning and even landscape but architecture, which we haven't discussed at all, is that there are other techniques available which may be a form of resistance even to this phenomenon that you're so sure is happening around the globe, but doesn't really encompass the entirety of urbanization around the globe. So is that an actual distinction between, in your mind, between kind of the role of the architect versus the role of, let's call it an urbanist, whether they call him an urban designer or a planner, or actually a kind of a sociologist-oriented urbanist, or a landscape architect who actually thinks a heck of a lot more about things than buildings. So is it is the architecture professional limited in a way, limiting itself in this era because their only technique is to build, whereas the needs, whether it's in Angola or for that matter in Detroit, is to produce something other than additional buildings?
Perhaps. But I don't know, the distinction simply doesn't exist the same degree in my mind. I'm sorry. It's something that I never really think about, because I mean I do projects on either side of the spectrum, small buildings and large buildings, and even projects where we take away buildings as an urbanist. And I think it's that kind of, and I regard all of that architecture, and you could call it all of it urbanism. So, but the point of the subject, and particularly the point of the subject also in an academic context, but also in our profession at large, is of course precisely that. It's to derail the traditional reflex that the solution to any problem is a building. Because that is what architects, any client comes in, he may have all sorts of problems, but an architect will always tell you, you need a building. Why do they say that? Well, it's obvious why they say that. And what I find fascinating about this thing is that the evidence that you shouldn't add another building is so abundant and so in your face that even the staunchest, stubborn kind of blinkers on architect will not remain immune to the devastation that actually building can cause. So I think in a way, by showing so many buildings and so much architecture, I might have unwittingly made your point. So thank you.
You're welcome. So what might that have to do with, say, the way that the next generation of architects, or planners for that matter, or urbanists, if they want to call themselves such, how should they be trained? What should there be some adjustment in the way in which we grow up to be architects? Or
maybe not. I mean, I think one of the key things, the solution to any problem begins with the frank acknowledgement that there is a problem. And I think that's almost the stage we are in. I think a lot of architectural education would benefit immensely if it simply understood more of the context in which it operates, so that it can at least prevent becoming complicit in a number of things that where it thinks it's doing good, it's actually doing wrong. But beyond that, so I guess it's quite okay for the training of an architect is to momentarily pause the reflex to learn how to design buildings and simply study this stuff for a while and come what may.
Yeah. We should probably try to engage the audience too, if there are questions, which I'm sure there are, but I didn't want to.
Well, I was just say one more thing about the question about how we should be training our students and ourselves to kind of deal with these problems. And this is going to be so obvious, but I just want to make a plea for thinking about the kind of the multiplicity of activities that occur in a site and at different sites that create what I'd call everyday urbanism it's so much more than just the building and the techniques of the building. And one of the things, a problem that I'm seeing, it's kind of the complicity of the government and the developers, whether it's in Angola or in Latin America or whatever, is this idea of the focus on housing, the house. That somehow if you have a house, you're creating the foundation for urbanism. And I do agree, I take seriously your comment that people can make a place lively even if it's mass produced. So human interaction can overcome the kind of the trauma of a terrible mass-produced design. But I do think that we want to be designing for those places from the get-go and not making sure that people just have to kind of remake them to make, to kind of correct the errors of the designs that are focused on the building and don't think about the liveliness of the urban experience. So I think that we have classes that focus on that here, but we could do more to teach our students about the multiplicity of environments that create the kind of experiences of urbanism, seen from the perspective of human beings that are going to be in the buildings that we're designing for them. But I know other people want to say this.
You may not need to answer that question. Yes. So, Michael, there was a young man who raised his hand first, and perhaps you can follow.
Hi, Reinier. You mentioned the cities nowadays are competing with each other to attract people, but I was looking at the news about Quilamba, and I saw a lot of titles. It's like the 10 coolest ghost town in the world, the 5 ghost hotspot, 20 things you have to know before you go to Angola. So the phenomenon of problem become a phenomenon of amusement, and the empty cities' inability to attract people to live there become the reason that attract international visitors. So how do you think of that paradox?
Of course, in as much as extravagance is an essential ingredient of competition, of course extravagance can work in any direction. What you see very much is that in the competing for attention in modern media and in general is that almost any extreme becomes newsworthy, whether it's good or bad, and that in a way you get a situation of a kind of Nietzschean beyond good and evil in the face of extreme, and that the extremity defies the value judgment. I think that is, and that's also where the interesting relation to human use comes in, because it's a very weird situation where, you have criminals in talk shows, because that attracts people. You have the most weird phenomena. Just as long as they're unusual and extreme, they have some sort of marketing value. And indeed, Quilamba was one of those things too. At least in the media it's been portrayed as such, almost to the point that when you find it inhabited, which is good, it becomes a disappointment. And it's a very perverse twist.
There's actually an odd relationship back to Detroit, where there's a kind of a, where the notion of there's actually a term, ruin porn, right?
Yeah.
Ruin porn.
Ruin porn. And there's dozens of publications, and in fact a kind of a tourism little system by which you visit Detroit or Baltimore to see the decline of American civilization or whatever. But Michael, right? Yeah.
Well, I want to come back just for a moment to the balcony that looks like a balcony meant not to be occupied, and you thought you were mistaken. But I wonder if the Herzog de Meuron terraces aren't exactly that in this sense. What our students have it's almost like a new what the Beaux-Arts called a partie, which our students call the trabeated stack. And what that means, and the Dutch kind of started it, but our students have perfected it because this elegantly thin slab with a highly variable edge that changes as you go up, which solves their problem that they don't always know how to wrap. They can't. It solves the problem of figuring out the facade, because it doesn't really have one. It looks great in a study model, and it actually looks great unoccupied. And I'm thinking of the Miami parking lot.
Yeah.
It is a fabulous empty building that occupying it distracts from it. So I wonder if capital hasn't found a new kind of typology that exactly satisfies the unoccupied building in it, because it doesn't, you don't need lights, you don't need curtains, yeah.
Yeah, and
I
the
think
inhabitant
that
becomes
was
an intruder.
a highbrow
observation.
moment of impotence. Yeah, that was.
So, Reinier, I just want to ask you about Detroit. Just joking. So it seems. I mean, of course, that much of what you're talking about has to do with the kind of rise to hegemony of finance capitalism, a particular modality of capitalism. And then housing within finance capitalism becoming more and more primarily, or leaning towards it operating as a financial instrument. So we could call it a kind, as I think you have in various ways, a sort of post-bodily version of housing, or a post-shelter version of housing. And then maybe we could say it's a post-human form of housing. And I'm kind of curious in this kind of thinking of post-humanism in relation to this phantomness, and if we think of it as a kind of avatar of post-humanism, how you might speculate or make connections to other avatars of post-humanism. So, the kind of data center and architecture.
Yeah. Although that is that is a different thing, because I mean the role of a data center isn't necessarily a speculative object for finance. It really is a house for machines. And of course, there's a long tradition in architecture of building buildings for machines, sometimes very, very beautifully. But the comparison that springs to mind, I mean, at one point, a stash of gold at Fort Knox was the counterbalance to the financial system. Those days are over. But currently, it is the collective real estate property value that acts as a balance to the financial system, but it's about as unfunctional as a pile of gold. So it's like a piggy bank. It is like concrete. What was gold was concrete, and its role in that sense is becoming manifest to the point that human use almost becomes incidental to the object. I think that's
that's precisely.
I'm not sure that's a creation entirely of the last 20 years. I think that they're not as extensive, but there are examples of this across kind of history. Western
I
history.
think you're right. I mean, the quantas of architecture has functioned as a financial space for since the beginning of architecture. But I think Reinier has a point in its increased emphasis, let's say.
Yeah, and the scale of it has certainly become much more prevalent. There must be. There, yes.
All right, Reinier, when you put up your graphic showing which countries were democracies, pseudo-democracies, and all that, I wonder how old that graphic is. Cause
that's outdated by and large, but it's indicative of the fact that there are three systems, well, not even systems. It's indicative of the status of elections.
Okay.
Either you leave them to chance, which is what a Western democracy is, and you end up with weird presidents sometimes, or you don't have them, or countries where you have them and you know the outcome in advance. That is simply all that thing says. And that changes. I mean, we would have called Turkey a democracy 20 years ago, not anymore. Hungary, Poland, respectable members of the European Union are sliding in a similar direction. It's certainly not a static map. And in as much as it is wrong, I apologize, but the point of the map is the three-way system, and that yellow is on the increase,
all right,
which I would stand by.
Did you have a question about this? Yeah.
Well, I noticed that Nigeria is marked as a pseudo-democracy, and I do know that for the first time since their independence in 1960, they had a transition in power from what the incumbent actually lost an election, which was a huge deal to them. And so when I saw that, I think that they would say that they're solidly a democracy now, and that the democracy is, while it's pretty young, that it's growing from strength to strength. So I just wanted to
point that out.
Very hopeful. We'll change that in the next iteration.
There's probably shades of yellow, obviously, if you really wanted to kind of get.
Yeah, there's the shades of blue too. And
yes,
shades
exactly.
Of red
yes,
too.
exactly.
So, I mean,
yes, right. Yeah.
But I mean, if you make too much nuance, you can't hold a
Yes.
lecture.
So, whoever has the mic can speak.
I just wanted to pick up on the idea that are these things really differences in kind, or are they differences in scale or in degree? Because, for example, like streetcar suburbs in the U.S. sometimes took 30 to 50 years to actually fill in. And, on the converse, some of the stories in major news outlets about the Chinese quote-unquote ghost cities have had to be retracted or updated because some of them have turned out to be untrue. So I wonder, are these real estate speculations as flimsy as they appear, or in 50 years will we see that, although some of them are failures, maybe the phenomenon is more rational and predictable than it appears?
Well, we came across this clearly when we started to study the phenomena, and we set certain parameters to define yes or no. But I mean, anything built in the last 10 years, of which more than 50% stood empty for more than a year, qualifies one way or another to be on this list, particularly because the pressure on real estate to be inhabited or sold from the get-go is only increasing. I mean, things are sold off the drawing. Things are sold off sketches. So in terms of sales pressure is enormous, which means that when a building stands empty, even for a month after completion, the economic loss that it represents is enormous. And it would be very interesting to make a calculation of the volume of emptiness that we will find globally, in a way, take the amount of money missed out on, because they're all calculated to hit the ground running, to make money from day one. So the economic loss or the economic burden of this thing, to assess that per country or perhaps globally, would be a very interesting thing to do, because yes, they get populated, but when they get populated even a day or a week too late, the economic costs of that are enormous.
I don't know hardly anything about Angola, but I know something.
I know nothing about Detroit, so.
And I won't ask any more questions about Detroit. But a point that you made, respond to a point that you made. If you were to visit Washington, D.C. in around 1825, you would see gigantic, wide streets with trees along them, and not a building in sight except for a Capitol building, actually under fire at some point in the 20s, because, and so the idea of sort of so the notion that some things get finished after a while, again, is not simply a product of the fall of the Berlin Wall. Mm-hmm. Too many things seem to be the product of the fall of the Berlin Wall, and I'm not sure I subscribe to quite that condition. But secondly, in China, the race will be between how soon these things will be occupied versus how quickly they will degrade, because the construction of these things is fairly shoddy, and the longer they stay uninhabited, the quicker they will begin to kind of decline. It's clear to me they will eventually most of them will be filled, because the demand is great and the rise of the middle class continues, at least for a while in China. But the problem will be if some stay too long, they'll become uninhabitable as opposed to simply empty. Yes, right.
So we were briefly talking earlier about there's ingredients to an urban condition that we should be thinking about more broadly. I find the project to be a unique opportunity to start to qualify the importance of these ingredients, because you have an instance where one of these ghost or phantom cities ended up being inhabited, the one that you went there for. Does it have anything that another one does not? Is it a distance from a place? When do people start to find the balance and invest in inhabiting the place? Like, when does it become more optimum to live and do the commute?
Well, it was very important that thing became a success. So I think there is, after the Chinese made their money, I think there were a number of measurements taken on behalf of the Angolan government, which was in a way reduce house prices very, very strongly, set up a mortgage system where I think you can, pay off your mortgage in 100 years, which means you get a manageable monthly payment. So they made the adjustment to make the thing affordable for them. And they did that because that was a highly publicized project and needed to be a success. Whether they can do that for every single one of these developments without bankrupting the country, their own country, remains to be seen. Because, I mean, the whole point is this is also a product largely of an accident. In China, there is a middle class based on gradual steady growth of the economy. This is an economy dependent on oil, 100%. They've sold even their fishing rights to the Russians. They're dependent on selling oil. The refined oil is being important in Angola because they haven't even got the industry to refine their own oil. So it's purely what's in the land that is being go, which means that at the moment the price of oil drops, they are so deeply screwed that the fact that a prospective middle class, a prospective demographic which would inhabit these things, simply doesn't exist. I mean, the currency is one-on-one correlated to the price of oil. So it's a curious real estate, and that's of course interesting because when real estate becomes a prediction, which is my argument that after the Berlin Wall it has once again maybe become. If real estate is a prediction, and then planning is very, very difficult. And also the notion of a traditional urbanism, which is a very strong planning ethos, becomes a prediction. And the essence of a prediction is that it can be wrong. And that 50% of the time it is wrong. And then urbanism happens on a vast scale. So it's a chance, it's a gamble with a huge risk, because when the gamble goes wrong, you get kind of a frightening numbers of these empty things.
Yeah. Oh,
Yes,
sorry.
please.
So to me, seeing that image of those slums next to these apartment buildings, that just hurts. I see that, I'm like, wow. And to me, like, I'm very practical, and I'm like, of course, there's this long-term. You want to come up with some sort of a solution to provide a long-term structural solution that this doesn't happen anymore. Hopefully, that we are going to build more for the people instead of for investments. So that requires a lot of thinking in a very deep level. But on the other hand, I was just wondering, like, to what extent did the students in the studio project, or does the office think about solutions, like practical solutions, but also not only from a top-down perspective, but perhaps from more of a bottom-up community perspective? Do you think about that, and what are sort of the leads that you think might be the way to go to sort of solve this? Or
You sound Dutch, is that correct?
That's very correct.
Yeah. Well, that's not up to me, and we are halfway in the studio, and another half is coming. So I think there'll be leads from many directions, but it's early to say. This is, in a way, what I've presented today, a kind of an enhanced studio brief. And the report of a field trip, which in a way makes that studio brief acquire even more scary dimensions. And the whole point is that this thing is meant to unsettle the traditional reflex of an architect, which I think it does, because and that's also essentially the whole point of the talk. And leads will follow with time.
And by the way, I think it's also, as you said, one of the points of your book, which I highly recommend, by the way. I will do a little bit of shilling on your behalf, right? And even ask a question about it. Because I think that you sort of uncover, not simply with too much building, but you uncover other dilemmas that are a consequence of either too much or too little power in the hands of the architect. The question, before maybe there'll be time for a couple more questions, but let me ask you, one of the things that fascinates us, sort of young people today is a potential utopia, which is often described as the kind of the smart city. Or rather, forgetting the term smart now, the notion that through data, through research and through data, and through our ability to collect enormous amounts of data, a certain set of kind of new, not intuitive, but sort of more sort of objective ways to understand the world might emerge. You wrote a very skeptical essay about smart cities. I actually, it was one of my favorite essays in the whole book. But say something about this, right? I know I'm throwing you off guard each time, but
Yeah,
that's
no,
the
it's
role
fine.
of a
It's
moderator.
fine. I'm
right?
thinking which essay, because there's a.
You attended a conference.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I mean, I object to the term smart city, particularly by people who haven't been occupying themselves with the city for very long, because, I mean, whenever they use the term smart city, they imply that everybody else is dumb, or that, that we've been dealing with the dumb city. So that is objectionable. But I think there's a number of things to be said here. It's an initiative on behalf of private companies, mainly tech giants. Yes. The ulterior motive there is invariably to sell more of their technology, yes. To sell more of their software, to sell more of their sensors, and they pose as urbanists, and we've dealt with quite a few of them, and once you scratch the surface and you're behind the front door, you find out that there's nothing there. Yet there is rhetoric, almost biblical, evangelical rhetoric about the level of redemption they can offer to prevailing crisis that almost echoes the same hubris as the modernists had in the 1930s. And just as they found their Waterloo, I'm sure the smart city people will find their Waterloo. I think it's very important to acknowledge that technology is agnostic. The internet brings more freedom, but in a different political context, the internet brings more surveillance. And so the whole thing is doubly edged. And I think to talk about the smart city outside a political framework is almost meaningless, because it is in the interpolitical framework that will decide if those things are useful or not. And it's typically very much a discussion, an extremely technocratic discussion at the moment, with a lot of kind of, with generally too much optimism.
Absolutely. Yeah. As have been prior utopias, of course.
I just want to say quickly before the next question. That description of what you're thinking about the smart technology, these are, technology firms masquerading as urbanists, you could have said it exactly about the presentation you gave tonight, those builders. It's exactly, you could do the exact same critique, slightly different. They're not doing it just with technology. But these are speculators and builders, mass-produced builders that are masquerading as urbanists.
Well, they bypass architects just as much as the smart city bypasses architects. I mean, that is very true. I thought you were talking about me for a moment, but.
Speaking of the political context, it seems to me that the role of private property structures the entire conversation, and it might even be the answer to the division between an architect and an urban designer, because an architect designs a place that's privately for someone, and an urban designer is at least supposed to, in principle, design a space that's for a lot of people. And everything you showed was just obviously, since it's for like an individual's profit, like the only thing that is keeping the people from moving in there is that there's a fence and that they don't legally own it. So I'm wondering if, as you said, some of our fellow architecture students here need to study that sort of political context and what your guys' thoughts are on the role of private property in the various problems you're talking about.
Yeah, how long do we have?
I've got all night.
Yeah, I want to go for a drink.
I live here.
Congratulations. Private property is a very ambiguous thing. I have an ethical, and that's why I ask how long do we have. I somehow have an ethical problem with the idea of owning things that you don't use. And I sometimes wonder whether a lot of the conflict, injustice, unfairness, etc. in the world is simply because that is the one ethic that in a way the very many religious books that different parts of the world abide by chose to neglect. So that's my view on private property.
Maybe one or two more questions before we.
I actually have one.
Oh, yes,
I mean, we're talking about this new sort of capitalist typology, empty housing typology, and I was wondering what your thoughts are on the examples of the contrary, where, for example, in Caracas, the Torre David, which is left half-built, was actually filled in, and this also happened in a hospital in Buenos Aires, and how this is sort of like a contrasting thing, and is that...
I think it's very, I mean, because one of the things and I don't know whether it's the efficiency of security firms that parade around these things. I mean, they were certainly very efficient when we were there, but I don't know whether it's there. Because I mean, one of the things, I'm from Amsterdam, and there we had a massive squatting movement in the 1970s when there was a vast speculation with real estate. People just, buildings go to rot, they collected rent and rent and rent, and there was a big squatting movement. And I simply wonder why in a context like this that doesn't happen, because you could even live with them without the thing being connected to electricity and water. They're still some way inhabitable, and that is maybe even an interesting model, a kind of mass organized squatters movement that would simply cut off that type of development by the path.
Maybe a final question. Not, I think we should go on with our evenings and drinks or work. One place that's never empty, by the way, is Gun Hall, as you might have realized. So I think that we should thank you very much for participating.